According to the Bank of America, some 70% of businesses do not have a succession plan. Perhaps because it is not an interesting topic, or perhaps because the questions that succession raises are just too hard to answer. How do you balance inevitable change while maintaining the desirable culture and goals? How do you create a successful company succession? It wasn't easy to assemble a panel for this topic because about 70% of the people we approached didn't want to talk about it. We did, however, locate two hardy souls who have navigated the transition and have the stories to tell. Architect Al Cross of PGAV decided early he would be a maker of places. He uses his 39 years of experience to create architecture for hospitality, science, and restaurants, branded destinations, zoos, and themed entertainment. Al has twice led PGAV to create the world's largest aquarium. Michael Blau is a principal and vice president of business development for Adirondack Studios. Theatrically trained and creatively inspired, Michael leads Adirondack Studios business development with a commitment to producing immersive and one-of-a-kind experiences. Michael is currently TEA International Board Vice President. Here to tell us about successful succession, please welcome Al and Michael.
Thank you, Steve. So many of you might not know, but this is a subject I'm very passionate about. I've gone through 3 succession plans in my life. Actually 4, if you count the paper route that I negotiated with my older brother when I was 10. I got the short end of the deal. I had to give him 6 months worth of profit before I could take profit. But anyways, I've gone through it. I want to talk about my dad, though. And this is really the first succession plan that I got to go through. My dad was an entrepreneur. He worked for many companies, but for many years was always looking for an opportunity where he could be his own boss, make a way for his family. 4 boys, I'm the second oldest, and my mother, Kathy, my dad's name is Jim. And he would look for opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. And I would help him, as my brothers did, in those opportunities. Had partnerships, insulation companies, and vending machine companies, and owning property, until the one that he established that was the best, the strongest for him. Building shipping containers and crates, specialty containers for paper industry, for railroad assemblies, you name it, specialty crates. And he established a business that provided for his family, provided for his employees' families. He put all of us through college, through graduate school. He took care of his customers, where they honored him. They wanted to work with only him and his company. And he created something that was profitable. So, 10 years into it, I graduate from college with a business degree, marketing and management, undergraduate school where my dad went. But my dad went nights, but I got to go because full-time, because he had the business. And I also took theater courses. I actually took more theater courses than I needed to, more than I had needed for my major. Twice as many theater courses as my major required. But I graduate. And my first job after graduation is a vice president. Vice president of my dad's company. Pretty cool, right? I get a good salary. Here I am, the desk right next to my dad so that I can learn the business. Now, the thing you need to know about my dad is he's really good and efficient with things. He does not want to waste money or time. And so he sets up a business that runs by itself. Literally, he could show up 1 hour a day during the week, and it would run itself. And he hires me as vice president to learn the business so that I could take it over. My older brother didn't want to do it. He wanted to be an actor. Dad said, go be an actor. Michael will take over the business. After 2 months of working for my dad, the biggest challenge that we had to go through was, where were we going to go for lunch? Because there were no problems. It ran like clockwork. By 6 months, I was bored out of my mind. My dad knew this. So I started as a vice president, and by 6 months, I decided I need to keep myself busy at work. So I started designing scenery on the side in the office. I started driving the delivery truck because I needed to get out of the office, because I needed to be busy. So I had to make a decision. And the decision was, do I stay and do I take over a business that is very successful, that is profitable, or do I go find my own path? And my dad did something really terrific, very rare, I think. And I told him about it, and he said, you should go on your own path. You don't have to follow my legacy. You don't have to follow what I've given you. Albeit a really nice, neat package, super successful, could have a great life, start a family, all of those things. Go find your own way. So I went to graduate school, and I got an MFA in design, theater design. And then I left that, and I started to freelance design in many places. And then I started to teach a little bit. And from teaching, I ran a theater program for a little while in terms of producing a theater series and so on. And then from that, I get on board at Adirondack Studios. And I'm at Adirondack Studios for 5 years. And I get frustrated there. And the reason is because I want to do more. I'm my father's son. I want to build something. And at that time, Adirondack was not the place for me, so I left. And I went to another company. And at that other company, I was offered stock. We had a big celebration dinner, and the moment I needed to sign the paperwork, I decided not to. It wasn't a celebration dinner anymore. And I left the company. And I came back to Adirondack, because at Adirondack, I saw that there was a future. I was a stakeholder there. I saw that I could make things better. And so for 8 years, I worked very hard at Adirondack and moved my way up through the ranks, going from creative director to a vice president to now an owner. And what I do today, and what my role is today at Adirondack, is to make the company strong. I was an important member of the team to put a succession plan together for Adirondack Studios. It took 6 years in the working. 6 years to put a plan together. So I helped put that plan together, and we made a transition. We have new owners now, as well as the old owners, and we're still going through a process. And the owners, all of them, have entrusted me to look to the next generation, the owners after I'm about to leave. And so we're working on a plan for that right now, because we don't want to be at a point where the rest of the industry really is, which is owners who want to get out. But they want to get out fast, and you never get out fast. You want to get out with a plan. You want to get out in a manner that makes sure that everybody who's part of it gets the most, gets the best of what they want. And that's why I'm excited about the subject. Because if you plan well, you can give the most to anybody who's part of it. So that's my quick story.
So PGAV's succession story is actually quite different. We were founded in 1965 by Bill Peckham and Fred Guyton. Fred is the G in PGAV. And it was conceived to be a mainstream architecture firm, the firm that every architect graduates from architecture school thinking they're going to build. And over time, it was housed and headquartered in St. Louis. Then over time, a man named George Albers and a man named Mark Vietz, actually not much time, joined, and they became the four partners that founded the company. In the 60s, Fred in particular, managed to develop a sort of a sweetheart relationship with Anheuser-Busch, and that led to the first, I wouldn't call it a tangent, but the first meaningful effect on the trajectory of the company away from classic mainstream architecture to what you all know us to be now. And so in the 70s, the Busch Gardens were significant for us, and quite a bit of zoo work, including the world-famous St. Louis Zoo. I can bore you to death about St. Louis if you'd like. We had involvement in Universal Studios Orlando, PortAventura, and of course, ultimately, over time, SeaWorld. And that is one piece of our story. And across the course of those many years, a couple decades, architecture kind of changed, and the company kind of changed along with it. We had become far less mainstream, and we had developed our current destination focus. And then there was youth in the company who had shown an entrepreneurial spirit and had developed a realization that we could not only diversify, we could cultivate far more fields than we were if we were to continue, if we could just change the trajectory of the firm. And so in the early 90s, the original partners started to change a little bit. George Albers actually left the company for health reasons. And he was, he immediately stopped working in the early 90s. Guyton and Viets really ran the company. Viets runs Kansas City, and Guyton ran St. Louis. And they came to a realization that there could be a transition. There could be a succession. They decided there shall be one. There was a conscious decision that there should be one. So then they were faced with the choices that people who do this are faced with. You can sell the company on the open market someday. You can determine if you need to infill in terms of gaps or leadership deficiencies that you might possess by bringing someone in, or you can figure out how to do it internally. And at this point, Mark and Fred came to the realization that their greatest creative achievement was not necessarily a building or a theme park or a relationship with a client, but rather the company itself. And they still believe that to this day, and that is what led them to the very conscious choice to develop what's the word I'm looking for? What are we talking about?
Succession plan.
Succession plan internally. And that led them on a long process of 6 steps. So the first step was to make the decision, to face the choices and to agree with each other that it was worth doing, and that there ought to be a succession. So then the next thing that they faced was identify who it shall be and begin to grow them into the leaders they needed to be to take over the firm. And failed to mention earlier, we have 2 offices. So Kansas City is about 25 people. St. Louis is about 110 people. So 2 very different entities, but these guys stuck together. There was a third partner along the way. His name was Fred Walton. We also happened to do urban planning. And Fred Walton is a very opinionated guy. He's actually a very brilliant guy, and he built a great business for us. But ultimately, he sort of faded sooner than the other 2 in terms of pursuing the succession plan. So there are 2 men in Kansas City, Mike Schott and Steve Troster, and 2 men in St. Louis, Mike Konzen and Jim Moorkamp, who were the early identified individuals who were going to grow into the company, and they became vice presidents and officers. Then they entered into another long process where those people began to learn the details of the business that architects are not taught. in architecture school. There's very few things I do on a daily basis that I was taught in architecture school. But also the management and the history of the management of our company and our philosophy. So we are extremely conservative, financially speaking. It's actually a result of a lot of things. But one of them was a terrible event along the way where we had a CFO who turned out to be a bad person. And that was important in the development of this story. And then, so learn the management, learn the conservative method of how we deal with our finances, and then learn the lessons learned. What did Fred and Mark encounter along the way that the leadership and the new ownership needed to know? So we made a lot of mistakes along the way that a lot of firms that remained in mainstream architecture made, like multiple offices. We had a Tampa office. I can't remember how many offices we used to have. I think we had an Irvine office. That is ultimately, by the way, where the P ultimately landed. Dallas, et cetera. So a lot of offices, and all but one of them actually failed. We used to have engineers. Some of you probably are aware that when we do ride projects, we usually use a firm called EDM, which is a St. Louis-based engineering firm. That is actually the former PGAV Engineering. That just didn't work out. It was the wrong mix for those individuals. Then get through all that, ready to move to the sort of the final phase, and it came to perfecting the mechanics of how the deal was actually going to be cut. And a few interesting things happened to the selling partners, and they began to realize that this thing was for real, and that the baby that they had created was going to be somebody else's. And it started to get emotional, and so the youth, the inheritors, had to be willing to accommodate, going through the emotional ups and downs that these people were facing. And then finally comes the event, the actual sale, which was pretty anticlimactic. And then a really interesting phase happened, which most of us have experienced, most of us who are with the company experienced intimately, and that is the fulfillment stage. So what happens after? And not long after, Jim Moorkamp contracted cancer, which quickly took his life, and we found out what we were made of, and thought I'd get through this. And that we could act on our values and the reasons that the company, that the culture needed to survive, and the power of the culture we had built was strong enough to make it through this. And that was an important realization to all of us, because there was concern, there was worry that, the staff wondered, how's this gonna work out? Are these the right guys to lead us into the next generation? And so the partners did a very interesting thing. They immediately began distributing more leadership to others of us in the firm, who we believed we could help run the company. And it worked. And so we are as strong as we've ever been, stronger than ever, and starting to think about how we're going to figure out how to do it again.
I appreciate the openness of both of you on this. There's a lot of topics within this topic that we could go. What going into it, what did you think was going to be the biggest problem? But then, as it happened, what turned out to be the biggest problem? I was always concerned about how would the staff accept it, and
we're not a big firm. We're a medium-sized firm as professional services firms go. But there's plenty of us, and we all matter, and everybody's opinions were important. And so there was some concern on a few people's part about just how would it go, and is this the right way to go? Does everybody get what they deserve in a process like this? For example, I'm sure a lot of you realize we employ a guy named Bill Castle, who I think we're about to celebrate his 50th anniversary with our company. So that's a long time, and Bill is one of the preeminent creatives in the industry. But Bill's not an owner of the company. And so we were worried about how those things would go down. And it is a testament to us, I think, but also a surprise that basically not a peep. That basically everybody understood that we were being led and owned by the right people. So,
if I can jump in, the concern is, and really from my experiences, my dad started his own company, and he didn't want to give it away. Really, that's what the core of it was. It was his, he had built it, he wanted to be there as long as he wanted to be there. Adirondack's the same way. The two founding owners are still with the company. Now they're transitioning out, but 42 years later, it's their baby. And the concern is, how do you have someone who puts their heart into something, their soul, all of the good times and the bad times, to then pass it on to someone else? And that was probably the biggest challenge in the first couple years of the conversation, is who can I pass this on to that I trust that will take care of it? The rest of it is mechanics, right? It's about how much money someone's going to get, when the money's going to change, who's going to follow the path, who's going to have roles, and so on. But that emotional part of it, that heart that goes into it, that was my biggest concern, because I actually had lived through it. And we weathered through it, and we continue to weather through it in terms of where things are. We've got a great team on board. We're very pleased with who came on board.
if I'm going to elaborate, if Mark Vietz was a classic control freak, and to the last day when he retired, he was still attending meetings, taking all the notes himself, manipulating the drawings by hand because he hadn't learned Revit yet. And he was deep into the details, chin deep into the details on a daily basis. Fred Guyton wouldn't know a detail if you wrapped it up and slapped him with it. I mean, he just, if I would walk up to Fred Guyton while he was still running the company and said, "Fred, I think I messed up and we're going to get sued," he wouldn't jump in. He would say, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" I mean, he was a deep delegator. And yet, when the event came, Mark had one foot in his fishing boat, and we haven't seen him since. Fred won't go away. And he still comes in the office. He talks to everybody. He's still preaching the lessons learned. Don't let that guy do this. Remember how this went for us. It was an interesting study in personalities when the event actually happened.
When you go through this, do you have a lot of outside counsel, or do you just kind of worked it out?
We worked internally for the first part of it, and then we brought in outside counsel. So people, our accountants and our attorneys and so on, all to talk about the process. But once again, that's process-driven. It's really about determining what you want. As a current owner, what do you want out of it? And that's where the title of this thing comes. Do you want a legacy that carries on forever? That's one end of the scale. Or do you want a boat? And the boat is make some cash and go have a great retirement afterwards and go fishing or whatever you want. And there's a scale in between. And you have to figure out where you land as an owner. But you also have to figure out where you land as a potential new owner, what your desire is. There are good things and bad things about becoming an owner. Phil actually mentioned it the first thing this morning, right? There's responsibility that comes along with that. And that responsibility you have to take very seriously if you're going to be a good owner. So where do you fall in that as well? So everybody's got to figure out, what do they really want? And that's the challenge, is how do you categorize all of those important things at any given moment? Do you want to provide for your family? Do you want to provide for your employees? You want to provide for your employees' families? All of those things. Do you want to take care of your clients in the same manner, that culture that Al talks about, that PGAV has? It's the same consideration for Adirondack. Are we going to be stewards of that culture that started 42 years ago? Who are those people that are going to carry that mantle and make sure it continues on again and again?
Somebody comes up to you and they say, hey, we're thinking about a transition. What do you tell them?
It's a conscious choice, and you got to work through what the options are and decide what you want. In our case, it was the realization that you know, the culture was what everybody, both old and new, seller and buyer, wanted to preserve was clear, simple, and inarguable. In fact, the one partner who sort of faded early didn't really think that. And I think it's why he sort of took himself out of the picture. He realized he could just sell down sooner and not be a part of the transition. And because, you know, the parties that were selling and the parties that were buying were on a clear, agreed, you know, consensus goal. And that is really super important. What we did doesn't have to be what everybody does, obviously. People sell their firms. You know, people bring in an expert to buy part of the firm and take it in and change the trajectory into a new direction. Happens all the time, but you got to know what you want to do. You don't just do it because it has a value. You do it because you know there's a need, and you have to identify it and know what you want to do.
It is about super clear expectations. This is going to happen, and when this happens, then this thing can happen next, and so on. Because through the process, people change their mind. Things change along the way. Somebody might want to get out sooner than they thought. Is there a plan in place to address that? Is there not a plan to address that? Something horrible can happen where someone can pass away. And then how do you deal with a transition that way? What risk do you put to the company? You have to really think moment by moment through. And it takes time to do that. It isn't, okay, we're doing a transition plan, let's start. You really have to do your homework and get it all in place so that when the good things and the bad things happen, you're ready for it. And you have a plan in place to say, oh, we go to 2B in terms of our plan because this just happened. Great, we can follow 2B. We all agreed to 2B. Didn't we agree to 2B? Now, you can always renegotiate, but it makes the renegotiating go a little bit easier when everyone agreed from the start. So really, it's about thinking forward and ahead. And that's one of the reasons why we're looking to the generation beyond me and my other partners. We're going to put a plan in place so it allows for others to follow it. Because we waited 40 years to start a transition plan that probably should have started 10 years ago. It'd be so much easier, but we're here. We got there. But it's about planning.
I've heard you both say culture again and again, unless then I expected to hear more about stocks, money. So is that the big driver on all this, culture more so than the mechanics of the money and whatnot?
If I can jump in, it depends on what you want to do as owners. If you want to sell and get out and make as much money as you can, that is different than preserving a culture or a legacy. You have to determine where you sit on that scale once again. If it's really about how much money you're going to make, there are things that you can do to make your company worth more money and more viable to be bought and sold. There's many things to do that, and there are experts who can help you to do that. but there are internal things that you can do also. And if you want to do that, that's terrific. Go for it. But with Adirondack, and I know with PGAV, is there was a desire to carry on a tradition, a desire towards excellence and continuing excellence. And that's the legacy part. And that was really important to the owners and to the current owners. So the mechanics jump in if you want to make money. That's really where you go to. But if you want to have a legacy, you got to really figure out who the right fit is. Adirondack, we have 8 criteria for what a shareholder needs to be, responsibilities. I'm not going to share them with you, but we have 8 criteria. We sat down and figured those out as to what the importance of those things are. And we live by those every day.
To me, it's about what kind of people you are, and how you're going to treat yourselves, how you're going to treat each other, and I agree with everything Michael said. In a vacuum, it's a transaction, and lots of ways to evaluate a company, and all those things are absolutely true. In our case, it was really obvious to the founding principals and to the incoming principals that the firm is the culture. The culture is the firm. The culture is the thing. And it's bigger than all of us. The people are the culture. It's not the projects. It's not the obviously, client relationships are spectacularly important, but that's not what it was. It was about the culture and the firm. The firm is the thing. So that's what caused our story to come out the way it came out.
Say there's people, and the wheels are turning in their head out there. What's their first baby step to do this if they want to do it?
As owners, it's what do you want? What do you really want? And we all, as you work on something, you always think you want to make more money than is physically possible in the real world to get out of it. You need to understand that, right? Because you went through the hard times. You're always going to think that you can get more than what you think you can get. So you got to understand that, number one. Number two is who do you trust? Who do you really trust to be able to pass on the company in terms of the transaction? And wherever you sit on that scale is where you go. But you have to really start there, in my opinion.
I can't say it any better than that. That's right.
As an individual and as a company, what did you learn?
The act itself, the sale itself, was something that we have for some reason that not all of us really fully understand, we have the ability at PGAV to create a great deal of loyalty. So most everybody at PGAV has been there quite a long time. So we saw this thing happen. All of us saw this thing happen right in front of us. And the thing we learned was that we could stick with it, that the values we felt like we thought we believed in actually worked, and worked through surviving an ownership transition, and worked when the bad thing happened right after the ownership transition, and still working. And could I say that I knew all that before? I guess I could say that, but there's a definite there was a palpable realization that occurred as a result of all this, and the continued success seems to continue to confirm it.
We learned something that we didn't think we'd learn, and that's that there are many employees who've been with the company a long time, and we wanted to initially reward them with ownership. We thought, oh, they've been here, they've been dedicated, they should get a reward for ownership. And then we discovered the criteria of what a good owner is. And we had to cross people off the list. Not in any mean way, but just because they wouldn't be good owners. They're excellent employees, They're excellent stakeholders in the company, but they're not shareholders. They wouldn't take the mantle of being an owner the same way someone who a true owner would be. And we had a hard time with that. And that's really the hard time for the next phase that we go through as well, is what are the right people, the right fit? And then you got to look at the mix of the people too, because everybody brings something different to the mix. Really, you got to look at, are you going to have everybody who's financially sound in terms of running the business and no one who's creative? Well, maybe you might want to do that, but that's going to change a culture. You got somebody who's got more of a business development savvy like myself who comes on board, or someone who's more technical in knowledge, or more practical or pragmatic. You got to look at the mix of who those people are. The original owners, they got together because they knew they were going to stand by each other and they complemented each other. You want to get owners that complement each other. And we learned that you have to look at that mix. And that's a difficult thing. It's really difficult because that means the people who think they should be owners but are not going to be owners, there's an emotional hurt that happens there as well. And how do you address that? The business part of it, once again, you can figure that all out. But it's that human element, that culture part of it, that was something that we really learned.
And if you've got 30 years invested in a company, it's not crazy to think you deserve something, right?
Absolutely.
But it doesn't make you owner material. It doesn't mean you'll be a good steward of the thing. And you do have to think your way through that stuff.
And you find other ways to reward. You find other ways to make sure that people feel that they are appreciated and worthy and all of those things. But the mechanism isn't, oh, great, you've been here, you've done your time, here you go, here's your certificate.
And the only other thing I would add to that is that in addition to finding people who complement each other, there really is no replacement for respect, for mutual respect, because I can compliment somebody, but I may not like the way they live their life or like the way they go through a decision-making process. And I've actually, in a previous life, before I came to PGAV, went through 2 transitions where mutual respect was not the precious commodity. It didn't exist. And it brought, I've seen it bring a firm down, and there has to be respect between people who jointly own something as important as these things we're talking about. Because experience suggests that people will disagree. And so if you don't respect each other, that can be the beginning of a long, hard slide. But if there's mutual respect, you can always work it out. You can always come back to being stewards of the thing you're trying to protect. That's what you need.
Before I go to the house for questions, if you had to do it again, what would you do different?
Probably start sooner on the next succession plan, which I think we're kind of currently in item 1 of my list. It's relatively fresh for us. The transaction happened 5 years ago, and then Jim died again shortly after that, not even 2 years after that. And we are now beginning to think, okay, how will the current leadership manage to hand it down, protect what we have and manage to hand it down? And I don't think it's ever too soon to start on the next succession plan. Sounds like Michael's ahead of us on that.
We're trying to do that. Part of it is also fiscal responsibility because there are costs associated with transition plans. And the sooner that you get things in place or you strategically plan for those things, then when the plan kicks in, you don't have to put a strain on the company. No matter what the economy is, how much work you have or whatever, you've got the ability or the strength or the foundation to make a plan happen. And that's something that we should have started sooner. but we weren't ready to because emotionally we weren't there yet. So to get the emotional part's important to start, but you also have to get all of the other things in place so that when it's time to hit go, you're safe, you're secure, you're ready to go. And that's something that we probably could have done better in hindsight in terms of what's there. We're certainly putting those in place now.
Actually, I left PGAV for a short time, which was probably the biggest mistake in my life, and luckily got to come back. And I went to a firm who had offered me a partnership, the firm I started my career with, and that was the failure mechanism of that intent to succeed. They weren't ready to do it. They just kept taking all the money out of the company. Mm-hmm. And they talked about succession, but they didn't plan for it. They didn't, they didn't have a Christmas account for it. Mm-hmm. They weren't ready. They weren't ready fiscally, financially, responsibly, and there was also a genuine lack of respect between those people, which is another. So I'm glad I got out, and I'm glad I got to come back to PGAV. But anyway. Yeah, you got to plan for it, just like you got to, plan for college and plan for stuff that costs money.
Questions from the House? Yes, sir.
Let's talk about the big bear, or actually mouse in the room, Disney. What's going on there? They were having a succession plan. It's gone away. What would be your advice to the Disney Board of Directors right now?
That one's on you, dude. A huge problem there in that Bob Iger is a really brilliant guy. How do you replace somebody like that? That's really hard. Anyway, you answer.
I agree. No, I agree. It's very difficult. And if you're in a position of leadership, you should be thinking about who's next. And that person who's next, who you think, or the series of people should be thinking about who's next after them. And that's a shortcoming that happens, is that you focus on yourself and your own path rather than thinking about creating a bench. That's what I use at Adirondack a lot. We have to create a bench of potentials. You don't have to use all of them, but you have to know that if you need a certain type of pitcher available at a certain time, you better have a bench in place. And I guess my recommendation is to get your benches, whoever it is, whether it's Disney or anybody else, get them lined up. The politics will happen, whatever that is, but at least you've got a strong bench there of players. If you don't get those in line, then it's going to be a mess, and you start fresh every single time. You're rebuilding. That would be my recommendation, is get the bench in place.
Another question from the House. Michael Mercadanti.
I want to know how you evaluated your firms, and whether you had outside consultants, and is the fact that you were handing it down, I want to know how you valued your firms, if you used outside consultants, and the fact that you were handing it down to others in the company affect the evaluation.
So by handing it down puts on an assumption that, here you go, you've done a good job, here's your stock certificate. So most transactions don't happen that way. There's a transaction that goes backwards and forth. So you have to put a valuation on it. There are many ways to value a company.
And lots of consultants.
And lots of consultants. And you can pay consultants a lot of money or a little bit of money. We had several people to give us guidance in terms of where to get to the value. Every single owner had a different opinion as to how to get to a number in terms of where it is, but we worked together in terms of coming up with a consensus. And that actually was an interesting sort of process, because if we were able to get to that, it means we can get through other things too. If we can agree on the dollars, because the dollars are the ones that people get really crazy over, right? If you can get to that, you can get through the other bits and pieces. So there are many methods. You can I'm not going to get into specifics of what we used, but there are a whole bunch of ways that you can put a weight on a company. And hop on the internet, and in 10 minutes, you'll see 5 different methods. There are the standard ones, and then you can put all the variables in that you want to adjust the value of a company.
We've got 1 minute and 22 seconds. All right.
We had the good fortune of having a CFO who was a brilliant woman, had been with the company 30 plus years. She actually left recently because she was elected the mayor of the city of St. Louis. And she was in big time politics as a sort of a parallel thing throughout her career. But she was really ready and really well informed going into the process. So it wasn't a huge struggle for us. And it's just an anecdotal aspect of our particular story.
Yep. I think MK.
Real quick, Lisa.
30 seconds.
30 seconds.
I have 2 questions.
15 seconds each.
What if no one in your company, no one within your company wants the job? And did the original owners of PGAV or Adirondack, when you were negotiating the succession plans, were there buy-sell agreements already in place between those partners?
So yes, in terms of if one owner decided to leave the other, those already existed. That started with a partnership many years ago, so there was a basis for that. Absolutely, you should always have those in place. And if there wasn't anybody who was interested in becoming an owner in the company, that crosses off an option.
Yeah. It just,
So you got to go somewhere else, What I didn't tell you about my dad is that he had no one to give the company to. He had no one to sell the company to. He closed the doors of the company after 32 years of running it. A successful company, but he closed the doors because he ran out of options. So the legacy that he created
10 seconds.
disappeared.
15. I promise I'll only go 15 seconds.
15 seconds.
Go ahead.
The PGAV's original owners had similar agreements. So it was actually one of the lessons learned. And it involved ensuring that spouses were treated in a particular way. And a similar way was instituted with the new owners. And that can be a really difficult thing. And for some weird reason, it happens a lot to architects. Architects die and the spouse comes in and thinks they understand the business. And of course, it's not always, doesn't work that way, but in our case, that was treated in a way that it was correct and comfortable, but that a spouse would not automatically become an owner. And I agree with what Michael said about if there's nobody to give it to, then it just takes you back to item 1 and just diminishes your choices.
Al Cross, Michael Blau.
Thank you.